Western Community College up in Roanoke, Virginia. I worked with Brian while I was an adjunct there. He is a professor there, teaching mostly graphic design, drawing, computer graphics, and I'll just turn it right over to you, Brian.
Okay. Well, we'll see, what form this takes. I'll admit it's going to be kind of free form because I'm really good at speaking about other people's art. I gave a talk last night at the museum in Roanoke about a Japanese animator who I put a show together for, and I can talk about everybody from Bruegel to folk artists like Howard Finster, but it's really hard to talk about your own work. So I'm just going to give a little bit of introduction, and I noticed in the sign-in sheet, there's one of the comments which I really like is, I need more explanation of this. So I promise eventually I'm going to give you somewhat of an explanation about some of these. And I was telling Michael, I told him when I dropped it off last week, I said, I'm going to send you these images that go with these paintings along this wall. And then frankly I forgot, but I promised that I am going to send them to him as soon as I get back to Roanoke. So first and foremost, I sort of want to make it clear one of the reasons that there aren't a whole lot of explanations up about them. I could put a little panel next to each one of them that gave a very specific explanation of it, but I like the idea of people looking at them and sort of developing their own ideas. I don't think it's really necessary. I don't think it's a really good thing for an artist to paint a picture and then say, this is what it means, and this is exactly what it means, and this is all that it means, and you have to understand what I meant. I mean, frankly, if you look at it and you feel a certain way about it, you have a certain reaction to it, that, as far as I'm concerned, is completely valid. So there aren't going to be little paragraphs next to each one, but it does need a little bit more of an explanation than is probably up right now. The other thing is, I do hope that they work, frankly, just as interesting pictures that people want to look at. I think that's the first and foremost thing. I hope that you don't absolutely have to have the story to appreciate the painting. And if you want to come up with your own story, that's fine with me too. And a lot of the paintings, I went through a whole period where all the paintings that I made were non-objective. So, there was no explanation, but I was an art major and I was also an English major, and so I like for things to have some meaning, and I like for things to have some narrative, and one of the things that I've struggled with as an artist is sort of balancing, making a painting that stands alone versus a painting that tells a story. And most of you are lucky to live at a time when you didn't have professors who went, painting's not supposed to be narrative, and it's not supposed to tell a story, and what are you trying to do here? Most of the painters who really strictly believe that have retired now, so you don't have to deal with them as much as I did when I first went to art school, but it was a big issue when I was in art school. So one of the things I try to do with my paintings is make an image that is interesting as a standalone image, but then also if you're really interested in it, there's a little bit more to it that if you do a little bit of study, you can find out what it's referencing and what it's based on and what it's about. And then in some of the cases, these are people that I've known or that I've interviewed that I'm very interested in, and if you get very interested in it, you can find out a whole lot about the people and the activities in them. I've also always been really interested in history. I had the most non-commercial major you could possibly have. I have degrees in fine arts and English with creative writing and a minor in history. So I managed to do you're completely unemployable with these 3 degrees thing when I got out of college. But all of that goes into my paintings, and at some point people say, well, see if you can give some advice to the students. And really, the 2 pieces of advice that I can give are make stuff. That's the chief thing. One of the main lessons that I learned that was really important when I was in school, I was very lucky to be in a program where there was a man named Ray Cass who ran this thing called the Mountain Lake Program. And it was almost this secret thing in Southwest Virginia, but he would bring these major league people down, from New York or up from Atlanta or over from California. So I really worked, not just met them or listened to them talk, but I made paintings with John Cage and Wayne Thiebaud. And then also on the other end, folk artists like this man named Howard Finster. And so there was a whole group of major artists that came through there. And the one thing that was painfully obvious about every one of them was they made work all the time. And there's this idea that you can fall in school where it's all about thinking about art and talking about art and going to the coffee shop and talking about how lame that art is and how cool that art is and how you could do better stuff than that. Make stuff. I mean, talk about it and think about it too, but make it and make it and make it. And the other thing that was a real icebreaker, groundbreaker, major, breakthrough for me was when this folk artist named Howard Finster came to campus. And Howard, for a period in the 80s and early 90s, was a real art superstar for a while. Like he was painting album covers for the Talking Heads, and REM shot their first music videos in his garden in Georgia, and he was doing covers for Time magazine and was on the Tonight Show. And he came to Virginia Tech where I was an undergraduate, and he did this painting workshop, and when it was over, I was the only person who wanted to drive him back to Georgia. He wouldn't fly. So I drove him back, and I saw these paintings he was making, and they really confused me because I was someone who thought that, art was supposed to be about stuff that was really obviously in your face important. Like it was supposed to be political, or it was supposed to be making this really dramatic, singular statement. And frankly, at the time, I was doing these giant, mural-sized paintings that were about Nicaragua, which I knew nothing about, except what I read in Rolling Stone. So, I was a real expert because I read an article in Rolling Stone. But they were really expressionistic and really in your face and really big. And the thing is, they were really bad. And I knew it on some level. Like, people would look at them and go, wow, that's really cool, man. Wow, you're really making a statement, man. I kind of look at them and go, well, it's big, and it's got an exploding head in it. So I went down and I was visiting Howard, and I'll never forget, I went into his studio and he was painting on paint can lids. And he had a painting of Eli Whitney, the inventor of the cotton gin, and then a painter of Eli Whitney's wife on these two lids. They were like this big, and they were really crude, and they were really good. And I was looking at them, and I was like, why are these good and mine are bad? These aren't big, and they aren't political, and they aren't in your face, and they aren't drenched in blood, but they're better than. And so I asked him. Finally I just said, what's the deal with these? He goes, well, I was reading about Eli Whitney, and he was really interested, so I painted a picture of him. And then I thought his wife must have had to put up with a whole lot. This guy was doing all this stuff, so I painted her too. And that was the entire explanation, but it was this moment where I was like, I can paint stuff I'm interested in. It doesn't have to be, a groundbreaking political statement about human rights in a part of the world I know nothing about. And really, from that point, he helped me. He made it absolutely clear that you are allowed to paint about what you're interested in. And so that's what I try to do. And the paintings in this gallery are sort of in really 3 different groups. And they all deal with, as I said, I have a real interest in history and a real interest in mythology and a real interest in Southern culture. And my paintings since that time with Howard have mainly been about Southern culture and Southern history. But these paintings started really about 8 or 9 years ago. And part of it was I finally reached the age where I would talk about certain people who I was interested in with my students, and this look would come over their face, like I was talking about Abraham Lincoln or something. Like I had a student who came to school in a Clash t-shirt, and I was like, I saw the Clash in Atlanta. He was like, you saw the Clash? But it was clearly like, that must have been right around the time of the Lincoln assassination. It was like this thing that was so far in the past. And you talk about seeing, I came to realize that someone like Johnny Cash, who was sort of ubiquitous through my childhood, is now almost like this statue to a lot of people. He's just not seen in the same way. Plus, there's a thing going on where history is not what it used to be. I mean, there's this weird thing going on where history and mythology and pop culture are all sort of getting mixed up in people's heads in a way that they didn't used to be. And I'm really interested in that. And so a lot of my work is about the way that actual history and religion and then fantasy and mythology and pop culture all sort of get mixed up and bumped into each other. And these paintings that sort of start the show are part of a whole, it's actually eventually going to be an installation piece that has 30 paintings in it. And they're going to be hung salon style. If you look at paintings from museums in the 19th century, they would hang like 30 paintings on a wall, and they'd be in like 5 rows and 6 across. And so they're all based on 19th century paintings, but then I took 20th century pop culture people and put them into them. So I'm not going to go through each one individually, but for instance, well, let's not start with that one because that's a little different. But this one is called Presley and the Shark, and it's based on a painting called Watson and the Shark. There's about 5 versions of it. The most famous one is in the National Gallery. And it was this 18th century painting of a shark attack off the coast of Cuba by Copley. And, essentially I've taken that composition and that story, but instead of Watson and the people coming out to help him, and Cuba, the harbor of Cuba in the background, it's actually Memphis in the late 50s in the background, and Elvis is in the water being devoured by sharks, and then the people who are coming out to help him are all 50s musical figures like Jerry Lee Lewis and Howlin' Wolf and James Brown and Johnny Cash and Gene Vincent and some other people are in there coming out to get him. And part of it is because I love art history, and I love that painting, and I love these weird sharks from 18th century paintings that have mustaches. Like there's a whole bunch of them that nobody had actually really worked from a shark, and sharks had this weird sort of gill thing going on towards their noses, so they would just almost put these mustaches on them. So you have a whole series of paintings that work like that, and some of them are very well-known people. Other ones are sometimes lesser-known people. That one deals with Curtis Turner, who was a stock car racer from Roanoke, Virginia, which is where he's actually from Franklin County, where all the Moonshiners was, which is next to Roanoke. And he actually won more races than anyone in NASCAR history, but he's sort of been written out of NASCAR history because he tried to unionize the drivers. And the France family didn't like that very much. So. But he got put in a Pinkham Rider painting, called Death on a Pale Horse. And I just sort of added these NASCAR figures to it. So some of them are very, sort of obvious. I keep trying to find a 19th century painting that everybody knows so that people will be aware of what's going on. But I'm very quickly discovering that it'll probably have to be Whistler's Mother. Like, I'm not sure there actually is a 19th century American painting that everybody knows anymore. So this whole group works along with this. There's a famous painting by an artist called Death of Wolfe, and it deals with the British General Wolfe who was killed while trying to take Montreal from the French. And in the painting, he's in this position, and the guys are all around him, and he's dying there in front, and there's Indians in the foreground, the Iroquois who were helping them. So I turned that into Death of Williams and have Hank Williams dying at the Pure gas station in Oak Hill, West Virginia, which is fairly close to where I live. And, just replaced, like he had a bunch of guns in the car with him, so I sort of screw these guns across the foreground. But this gun is actually in Death of Wolfe. I don't think he actually had a flintlock rifle with him in his car. So there's this combination of history and pop culture. Then instead of the Iroquois Indian, I put a Pontiac in the foreground because it's named after Indians. It had the Indian hood ornament on it. And then there's various little southern symbols in it, like possums. And I deal with a lot of folk artists who tell me about crows being, sort of being symbols of death, and if a crow shows up, somebody's going to die. So this whole group of paintings is really about 19th century American art and 20th century Southern pop culture, and paintings that I really like looking at. This is based on the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington, the Athenaeum, but I put Robert Johnson in there because he's the father of the blues instead of the father of his country. And I put his little, hellhound in the front, because one of his great songs is Hellhound on My Trail. Plus I like drawing really angry dogs. So sometimes you look for an excuse to stick them in. And then there's actually a voodoo symbol behind him, because he's the one who, if you've ever heard the story of him selling his soul at the crossroads, in Mississippi, so he could become the greatest guitar player in the world. So there's folk mythology in them, there's historical figures in them, there's pop culture figures in them, there's art historical figures in them, and it just sort of all comes together in this melange of, frankly, things that I'm sort of obsessive compulsive about. This one I saved for last because some of the paintings in here are about people who I actually have known and interviewed. This is called Briarwood Loses, and it's based on, there's a Winslow Homer painting called Briarwood Pipes that's of these two Union soldiers during the Civil War. It was painted from life, and they were Zouaves. Do you know about the Zouaves? They were actually Zouaves on both the north and the southern sides, and they wore these really Persian uniforms, which actually came to the United States through France. Like the French wore them, the French Foreign Legion. And I kept looking at this painting and wanting to reconfigure it. And there are these two brothers. They were called the Muse, well, they were the Muse brothers. They weren't just called the Muse brothers. And they were born in Franklin County, just like Curtis Turner over there. And they were albinos. They were African-American albino twins. And in the early 20th century, they were actually kidnapped by the circus, which you hear a lot, like a lot of circus sideshow people sold these little pamphlets, and all of them said that they'd been kidnapped by the circus, or kidnapped by a nanny who sold them to the circus. But they actually were kidnapped by the circus. Like Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey paid them a huge sum of money for the time in the late 1960s, and it's sealed. Like, you can't find out exactly what the contents of the settlement were, but the only explanation for it is somebody finally said, hey, they got kidnapped by the circus, like you owe them something. But I've always been interested in them since I was a little kid. I found this picture of the sideshow from Ringling Brothers, and they would take these big panoramic photos every year of the people in, well, what was the freak show. And they're in them for like 20 years, and I was always really interested in them because sometimes they're in tuxedos, and then other times they're in these uniforms that are almost like Zouave uniforms. Like they have these very Persian pants and these really highly tailored coats, and they exhibited them as the cannibals from Mars. Like that's what they called them. And they were these people who I was vaguely aware of, and then when I first got out of graduate school, I found this book from the 20s called Heredity and You. And it was this 1920s, frankly, eugenics book that had all of these really weird charts in it that had titles like How Two Attractive Parents Can Have an Ugly Baby. Or they would like rank professions according to sexual characteristics. And like, all the high-paying professions like banker and lawyer and doctor were all the most male professions. And, like nurse and, anything that was really low-paying were female professions. And so I was kind of interested in these charts, and then there were these pictures in the middle, and I opened it up, and there was a picture of the two brothers. And it said, these two albino twins born to normal Negro parents, this was written in the 20s, in Roanoke, Virginia, which is where I lived. And I was like, they're from Roanoke. And so I started trying to find them, and eventually it turns out that he had died. He died, in about 1970, but Willie Muse, who is this guy, lived until about 1997, and he lived about 5 blocks from where I was living. And so I went over and met him one day and talked to him a little bit. I'm doing a whole series of paintings of people that I interviewed and wrote articles about when I first got out of school. And once again, they're based on 19th century This one actually is based on an 18th century painting. And so we've got people like Screamin' Jay Hawkins, who was a great R&B singer in the 1950s. The only song you guys probably know that he did was I Put a Spell on You. But he had this incredibly insane, punch him up on YouTube. He's all over YouTube. He's had this insane stage persona where they would push him out in a coffin. And he'd, have skulls. He'd wear a bone in his nose sometimes. He just was insane. When I interviewed him, and this goes back to my interest in history and what's true and what's not true, he spoke to me for about 45 minutes about being in World War II and being involved in the invasion of Tarawa, which was one of the islands in the Pacific, were just a bloodbath. And he told me all about being on Tarawa and being captured and being a Japanese prisoner of war for a year and a half. And in fact, he's in a movie from the 80s called Mystery Train. It's a Jim Jarmusch movie, and it was produced by a Japanese company. And I interviewed Jim Jarmusch once, and he talked about how Screamin' Jay Hawkins wouldn't talk to any of the Japanese people on the set. He didn't have anything to do with them. But then when I wrote the article and started doing research, he was 15 when Tarawa was invaded. And he was actually involved in USO shows in Europe in 1945 as a singer. But there is no doubt in my mind that he believed that he was on Tarawa and spent a year and a half in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. So, as I started doing these paintings of these people, he sort of gets the Tarawa treatment. This is a photograph of Tarawa, and then he's got the bamboo cage behind him. I like Screamin' Jay Hawkins a lot. He was a wonderful interview, but I don't think he was in a prisoner of war camp during World War II. This is a guy named Sputnik Monroe who said the greatest thing to me of anybody I've ever interviewed. But he was a wrestler in the 1950s, and he actually desegregated the civic centers in Memphis, Tennessee, and Montgomery, Alabama, because he had such a huge following in the African-American community in those cities. He was a bad guy, he was a heel. Like, he called himself Sputnik right after the Russians sent Sputnik into outer space, which is the equivalent of calling yourself Al-Qaeda Joe now. I mean, that's how. And he sort of specialized in making people angry. When he was a child, he was raised by his grandfather, who was the bare-knuckle boxing champion of the Midwest. And I think it was a pretty rough childhood. Like, he didn't talk about it much. He just said he was a really tough guy. It's like, okay. He just had this expression on his face, like, don't ask me anything else about this. But he ran away and tried to join the army when he was 15, and they wouldn't take him. And he ended up in Leavenworth, Kansas, which is where the big military prison is, because he was in the Midwest, and he went there to enlist. And he went into a circus tent, and they had a guy in there who was their wrestler, and if you could stay in the ring with him for 3 rounds, you won. You paid, I think, 50 cents. If you stayed in the ring with him for 3 rounds, you got $3. And so he beat the guy. He was 15 years old and beat the guy. And the guy who ran the shtick came out and hired him to do it. And he just sort of developed this personality where he would bait people. He was like one of those dunking booth clowns. Like, he would insult people in the audience to try to get them in there. Eventually, he was such a fearsome figure that nobody would get in the ring with him, so they changed the rules. This is when he's 16, 17 years old, and people were allowed to bring any weapon that wasn't a gun or a knife. So, like, you could bring 2 baseball bats or 2, crowbars or 2 shovels or 2 axe handles, and he would have to fight you with whatever implement you brought. And he talked to me about learning how to make people so angry that they would just come at you and come at you and come at you and exhaust themselves. And later on, he decided to quit that, which was pretty rough living, and become a professional wrestler. And he went all over the Midwest, and he did a Gorgeous George routine where he grew his hair really long and dyed it blonde and would wear high heels and stuff to make people angry. And then they hired him to go to Alabama. And he got in his car and was driving to Alabama, and he stopped and picked up this African-American guy who was hitchhiking, And it was fine until they hit Mississippi. And when they crossed the Mississippi border, they were immediately stopped by the police. Because in 1957, it was illegal for a black person and a white person to be in the same car unless one of them had a chauffeur's license. And so they wrote him a ticket, they drove to the next county and got stopped, and they drove to the next county and got stopped. And Sputnik Monroe, who was in the business of making people angry, went, huh, if I keep doing this, they're going to be really PO'd by the time I get to Montgomery, Alabama. So we went all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, and by the time they got there were people there waiting for him. I mean, there were people just throwing things at him and just incensed. And so, you know, he sort of revivified the Alabama wrestling world and was such a big draw there that they brought him to Memphis, Tennessee. And the week before he went to Memphis, Tennessee, the Russians launched Sputnik, so he changed his name to Sputnik. And then he got to Memphis and immediately went to Beale Street and started going into black-owned bars so that the police would arrest him. And he was arrested 16 times. I think it was sort of a reverse sit-in. And they charged him, this is my favorite crime I've ever heard anybody charged with mopery and intention to gawk. And so, yeah, after he'd been arrested about 15 times, they took him to court and he hired a black lawyer and showed up in court. And I interviewed the lawyer, and this is what really interested me about him, because there's this big debate about, you know, Sputnik Monroe and whether, you know, he was really interested in promoting civil rights or whether he was just making people angry so they'd come out to the wrestling matches. And the lawyer, who later became the first African-American district judge in Tennessee, looked at me and he said, I got out of law school in 1940. And he said, and for 17 years, I've been going to meetings with the wealthiest people in Memphis. And every one of them would say to me, well, you know, if it was just about us, we'd do away with segregation tomorrow. I can be no problem. But if we have working class people desegregated, it's going to be awful. Like, it's just going to be uncontrollable violence. He said to me that Sputnik Monroe came into town, and within 3 weeks, he had set up this giant wrestling match with the most popular wrestler in Memphis, the good guy. And they were wrestling for a Cadillac. And they brought Rocky Marciano, who was the heavyweight champion of the world, in to referee it. And at that time, they would only sell tickets to 200 black people for a wrestling match. But they would oversell the event. And so Sputnik Monroe, you know, this was a huge deal. The place was packed. There were people outside. And they came down to get him to wrestle, and he said, I'm not going to wrestle unless you let my fans in. And they went, what? And he said, I'm not going to wrestle unless you let black people in. I'm not going to wrestle. They're like, well, we're going to have a riot if you don't wrestle. And he goes, actually what they said was, we're going to have a riot if we let those people in. And he said, you're going to have a riot if I don't show up. And so they let everybody in, and guess what? There wasn't a riot. Like, it was fine. And this lawyer who I interviewed said to me, he goes, the next week he could walk into those meetings and go, well, you know what? There seem to be all these working class people in the Civic Center who aren't killing each other, so maybe this doesn't have as much to do with them as it does with you. But Sputnik, for a long time, was a real folk hero in Memphis. And when he died in 2007, if you want to know about it, if you go on NPR, National Public Radio, when he died, they did this story in Memphis where they went to different neighborhoods and talked to people about Sputnik Monroe. And there were all these people who still remembered him, and some people still have pictures of him in their houses. So he's not very well known, and so I decided to do a whole series of paintings of him. The great thing he said to me, though, was, I asked him about making people angry, and I asked him what his high point in wrestling was, and he looked at me. I interviewed him in about 2002, and he was working as a security guard in Houston, Texas, and he was just a mass of scar tissue. Because when he wrestled was when they'd like cut along their foreheads so they'd have blood all over their faces, and they'd break their noses on, you know, the turnstiles and stuff. And he looked at me and just with this twinkle in his eyes, he goes, I started a riot once in Odessa, Texas. He goes, I made a woman so angry she threw her baby at me. And I was like, it was just, it's like, So certain people just deserve to be painted because they'll say, tell you a story like that. So these are part of that series.
What does it say on this copy?
Oh, it's Latin, it's vulnus sanascari, which means I injure to heal. So, yeah, there's all sorts of little symbolism. I'm also like a real medieval art geek, so there's all kinds of little symbols in these that are, you know, have medieval meaning or in Latin. So once again, it's the more you look at it, you could just take it at face value, that's fine. If you like the colors, that's fine. But if you want to start looking into them and looking into them and looking into them, hopefully they work on a number of levels. This is another one of the 19th century paintings. It's an 18th century painting called Boy with Squirrel, but I turned him into Elvis and put a possum in instead of a squirrel. That's pretty straightforward. And then this group, which is an ongoing group, when I was little, I lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, so I'm a baseball fan. You have to be, it's the law, like you are allowed to not be a baseball fan in Cincinnati. But I got really interested in early turn of the century baseball, and these are actually the paintings that started the sort of combination of mythology and history and pop culture. There's actually about 28 of these now, and I always joke, sort of half joke with my gallerist. I've got a gallery in Richmond and a gallery in Chicago, and we always joke about how these are unsellable paintings because sports people hate them because they have the mythology stuff in them, and the mythology people hate them because they have all this art historical reference in them, and art people hate them because they have athletes in them. But I'm going to keep compulsively doing them, and when I die, there will be like 1,000 of them in my basement. And somebody will go, this is so weird, we need to do a show of them. But these are all actual baseball players. I mainly paint people from between about 1890 and 1930. And they all are based on certain mythological figures and certain mythological painters, and they're all real baseball players. This is Josh Gibson, who was probably the greatest player in the Negro Leagues. They called him the Black Babe Ruth. And he probably would have been the first player, the first African-American player in baseball before Jackie Robinson. I mean, people were obsessed with this guy. He was great. Made arguably the greatest player ever. But he had a serious alcohol problem and probably a heroin problem, although that's sort of shrouded. So he gets to be Tantalus. Tantalus was a figure in Hades. Everybody knows about Sisyphus, the guy who pushes the rock up the hill and then it rolls down on him. Tantalus was submerged in water and was really thirsty, and the water would come up to just below his mouth and then would go down to where he couldn't actually get any. And he had fruit just over his head that was just out of his reach. So Josh Gibson, who couldn't quite, get there, gets to be Tantalus. And I put snapping turtles in because I like painting snapping turtles. Carl Mays is the only man who ever killed someone on a baseball field. He killed a man named Ray Chapman with a pitch. He fractured his skull. So he gets to be in the graveyard with Ray Chapman's ghost and the umpires in the background. Joe Jackson, who's the guy in Field of Dreams. He's the guy who walks out of the cornfield, who was accused of helping to throw the 1919 World Series.
It's Ray Liotta's.
Which he did. I don't want to bust anybody's bubble, but he took the money, okay. So, but he gets to have the Sphinx because he would never say anything about it. He would never admit whether he did it or not. So he gets to have a little Sphinx with him. And I went with a really 19th century English sort of Sphinx instead of the super famous Sphinx. Then these guys, you all know about Bat Boys, right? Before there were Bat Boys, where Bat Boys come from, the little kids who take the bats out to the players. At the turn of the turn of the previous century, before this one, in the 1890s into the early 1900s, they were dwarfs. And dwarfs were considered good luck. And so teams would have bat dwarfs that would bring the dwarfs out to them. It was really pretty awful. They would rub their heads for good luck. And if you couldn't find a dwarf, the next best thing to have was a hunchback. because they would rub the hunch on the hunchback. And if you couldn't find a dwarf or a hunchback, you were supposed to find someone with red hair. And it was pretty demeaning and pretty awful in some ways, but these are all actual bat dwarfs from various teams in the 1900s up until the 1920s. And this guy was actually a red-headed hunchback dwarf. And here's the horrible part. The Philadelphia Athletics found him after they'd had a really horrible season. They finished 22 games out of first place. And then they brought him in and they won the World Series the next year and set the record for most games won. So. But all of these guys are actual bat dwarfs from the turn of the century. This is Rube Foster, who was the man who founded the Negro Leagues. He also invented the fade pitch. He probably invented the slider. And he's sort of a tragic figure. He was a truly great pitcher. I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame as a pitcher. And he founded and organized, black baseball from roughly 1910. And then it was really taken away from him. In about 1925, the owners of all the teams sort of got together and conspired and threw him out. And he ended up in a mental institution in Chicago. So he gets to be Prometheus, who brought fire to man and knowledge to man. So he has the eagle that comes in and eats his liver every day, and then it grows back. And then finally, there's Grover Cleveland Alexander, who was arguably the greatest pitcher who ever lived, but he also was an epileptic, and he was drafted during the First World War and developed shell shock, a really horrific case of shell shock, which is now post-traumatic stress syndrome. And then he also developed his alcohol problem during the First World War. So he gets to have Cerberus, that sort of three-headed monster of, epilepsy and post-traumatic stress and alcoholism. And then finally, the last painting is, one of the bigger baseball paintings that go along with these. And it's just called Lions, Lambs, and Black Sheep. And I really don't want to explain that one because I've had people give me explanations from it. The best gallery talk I ever gave was in Winston-Salem, and this painting was up, and a bunch of people were saying, well, what's the deal? Are they getting ready to hit him with those bats, or are they paying tribute to him? I mean, is it about them coming to peace, or is it about violence, or is it about, unity, or is it about separation? And after everybody said everything, I said yes. Because I think it can be about all those things. But the Black Sheep editor, this is Ty Cobb, who, was arguably the greatest baseball player ever, but was also a sociopath. I mean, he was completely psychotic. And he actually had a pretty good reason for it, but I'll tell you later if you want to know. This is Josh Gibson again, and then Joe Jackson again. And then this is a great winged lion that I stole from a Renaissance painting. And then we've got lions and lambs with each other. And I was just telling Michael, now that I look at it, this is a painting that needs a whole bunch more lions and lambs in it. I think there's going to be a whole lot more of those come March. So, I'm happy to answer any question, if there's any questions, or you could just go eat pizza if you want. I've got to talk about it off.
Would you say that these baseball ones have to me there's double meaning because you juxtapose the baseball characters with the mythical stuff. Would you say that's the most powerful case of it?
Absolutely. And the whole thing, the reason I went with baseball players is because it really is the most mythological of American sports, sort of. In fact, a lot of people think of it as this thing way in the past now. And also because baseball players from the 1900s are still sort of visible as baseball players, whereas if you pick football players from the 1900s, everybody goes, what the hell is that? Why does he have a leather hat? Like he's 5'9" and weighs 140 basement. But yeah, there's something very palpable about baseball when America becomes America, when it becomes this sort of big country, and there's so much that sort of runs through the history of baseball that deals with, the rural and the urban, and with racism, and with, segregation and integration, and with pre-war America and post-war America, and even with with sports going from something that was kind of illicit and ill thought of to something that was, you know, hero worship. So, yeah. They probably are the most mythological and the least sort of intellectualized. You know, the least thought out.
Any more questions for Brian?
You ask about the colors if you want.
Well, I want to thank you, Brian, for coming to the gallery, to the FAB Gallery, and we're going to have food and drinks outside for everybody, so you can head on out there, or you can ask Brian more questions if you want. And thank you for everybody for coming.
Thank you.